Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who sent me to be a judge or arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will put down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool! This very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is the story of the rich fool. It's a family feud, if you will. Like all too many tragedies, this story begins with a family fight. And not just a fight, but an inheritance fight. Here we have two brothers who can't share together, live together, work together, or even just be together. Two brothers who have had enough of one another. The man shouting at Jesus out of the crowd is probably the younger one, who was more likely to have been slighted by the estate plans, the one who needs outside intervention to render an impartial decision on getting what he thinks he deserves. Coming to a rabbi to seek legal advice is a typical Orthodox response to a legal problem. But this guy deserves a category all his own. He is in a massive crowd, all listening to a dynamic, challenging word from Jesus, who is clearly a prophet at the very least. And for those in the know, he is the Messiah and the living Lord. This guy's issue is raised in public. How do I get my share of the family wealth? Tell my brother to give it to me. The man is so focused on his goal, so consumed by his desire for vindication and victory, that he misses the point of Jesus' message. Now, just before this interruption, Jesus was preaching to a standing crowd, standing room only crowd, numbering in the thousands. His lessons are challenging and chilling. Jesus was speaking against the most powerful element in first century Judaism. He was speaking against the Pharisees. He was accusing them of hypocrisy and of covering up less than honorable actions. He was addressing the greatest fear stalking his own disciples, the fear of impending persecution and the fear of being targeted for death. This is what Jesus was doing. And as Jesus offers encouragement to his disciples that they should not worry about how you are to defend yourselves or what you are to say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you at that very hour what you ought to know, he is getting into his sermon, and he's having more to say, but he gets interrupted. And Jesus responds to the man, but refuses to enter into the financial fray. He rejects the role of arbiter or judge over worldly wealth. He then goes on to expose the depth of the questioner's wrong-headed thinking with the parable of the rich fool. This parable is found only in Luke. This story weaves directly into the message, in fact, that Jesus had been preaching. that the course of our lives is not something we have total control or command over. A rich man, land produced an abundant crop, responds as anyone might. With his good fortune, he decides to build bigger barns. He decides to stockpile his huge crop and live off the bounty of that investment for the rest of his life, which he assumes will be long and lavish and lush. After all, he has big new barns full to the brim with a bumper crop of security. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? What possibly does he have to worry about? Except for the fact that, and despite all his potential riches, the man is not rich towards God. He's got larger barns, more grain. But is he a fool? Is he a fool? We look closer. The man in Jesus' parable is actually a model of personal financial stewardship. The land produces a bumper crop, and he doesn't even use up the unexpected surplus to build a bigger house. No, he certainly doesn't blow it on a wardrobe of designer tunics or high-performance sports camels. He doesn't. That would be foolish. You never know when a bumper crop will be followed by famine, and he wants to be ready. So he takes shrewd, thrifty steps to maximize his profits for the future. That's not foolish. He even tears down his old barns and replaces them with bigger ones rather than just adding more barns and using up the land. That's good stewardship. So what's the problem? What makes him a fool? The problem with the rich man in this story is not a problem of stewardship. It is a problem of faith. You see, his faith is in himself and in his stuff. He believes that if he works enough, plans enough, conserves enough, he can save his soul. That may sound like a stretch, but just listen to what he says. I will do this, he says. I will pull down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. He's talking to his soul. Whoever does that, like that, he does. He's telling his soul, don't worry, be happy. Everything's taken care of. He said, once I've built all this in these barns, I can relax, enjoy life without worrying about the future. Boy, he knows it all. He's got it all. Well, of course, we know he was wrong. At the end of the story, God asks, after he takes his life, he says, and who, all these possessions, whose will they be now? Who's getting these goods? Who's it belong to? Although the barns and grain and the land cannot save him, they do survive him. And whose will they be? You know what's interesting about this parable, and if you think about the young man who is talking about the inheritance, you see something in common there? Dad died, and the young man says, it's mine. I want my share of it. And I bet you the brothers in the crowd, I bet you he's sitting right next to him somewhere. Well, perhaps his sons, perhaps the man's sons, they too, soon enough will find themselves unable to share together because the father taught his sons how to hoard and be greedy. Maybe they'll find themselves unable to live together, work together, or even just be together. Two brothers who have had enough of one another. Perhaps, like all too many tragedies, this is the story of the rich fool and ends with a family feud. Who gets the barns? Isn't that what the brother is worried about, asking Jesus? This parable turns upon itself. In fact, the answers it reveals the young man's true issue. And I hope the young man sees this in the crowd. I hope he sees it. I hope his brother, who is sitting in the crowd, also sees it. I hope he's getting the message. The story points to the relationship the man has established with the good fortune he receives. And the problem is the man is in relationship with his fortune. And the wealth that is to give his soul a feast, a soul feast of the riches he's acquired with regard only to himself. You know, it sounds ridiculous, this man talking to his possessive and fearful soul, reassuring it that nothing bad is going to happen to it because everything's going to be okay because he has all this stuff. That it's all fine because I got all this stuff. And it's very tempting to say, anything to reassure a fearful soul. Even when we know our promises are beyond our power, he hasn't the power to promise that. Yeah, maybe the stuff will be there, but it doesn't outlive it. He doesn't outlive it. How many of us want to reassure our souls that our barns are full and we have all this stuff and everything's taken care of and we don't have to worry about anything, not even the future? Really? Well, let's find out what the church fathers, how they weigh in on this. The wisdom of the early church fathers is good. Ambrose wrote that Jesus is reminding his disciples that the things we cannot take away with us don't even belong to us. Our only virtue is the companion of the dead, if that's our sense of it. Compassion alone follows us. Augustine wrote that the wealthy farmer is a fool because how will he know where to look? When at the trial he starts hearing the words, I was hungry and you did not give me to eat, what's he going to do? What's he going to say? How about Basil of Caesarea? Basil noted that while the rich man privately and smugly congratulates himself, while he speaks in secret, his words are weighed in heaven, from whence the judgment comes upon him. Now, in Jesus' parable this morning, God condemns the rich man and calls him a fool, not because he's unintelligent, not because he has accumulated a stash of wealth. That's not the problem. But because he uses his success only for self-indulgence. He is short-sighted, lacking perspective and wisdom. He has stuffed his barns to overflowing with all that the land produced, the land that ultimately belonged to God. He kept everything to himself. He gave himself a soul feast, but he has ignored the needy. He has missed the joy of helping others. His hands are too busy patting himself on the back rather than giving a helping hand to those who are in need. Yes, he is a fool because he is poor in the righteousness that God requires. In fact, he became possessed by his own possessions. Now, I have a little story to tell. Summer is a good time to see hummingbirds flitter about. We have them come to our yard every year. I love them. In fact, they fly right around Joyce's office window in Blairstown. A family put up a hummingbird feeder. Almost immediately it became popular with all the hummingbirds that lived in the area. 2, 3, or even 4 birds would feed at one time on the feeder. The feeder would be refilled every day. Suddenly, the feeder, the usage was decreased to almost nothing. The feeder needed filling only about once a week. The reason for the decreased usage soon became apparent. One bird had taken over the feeder as his property. He was now the only hummingbird who used it. He would feed and then sit in a nearby tree waiting and rising to the attack that any bird approached, he would go buzz him. Guard duty occupied this hummingbird every waking hour. He was an effective guard. The only time another bird got to the feeder was when he was chasing another bird away. The hummingbird was teaching a valuable lesson. By choosing to assume total ownership of the feeder, he gave up his own freedom. He was no longer free to come and go as he wished and look at the valleys and the fields and the beautiful flowers. He was tied to the work of guarding his feeder, his stuff. He was possessed by his possessions. Story of the hummingbird. Our true hope for the future is not whether our treasure chests on earth hold piles of silver or piles of gold or sand, but that our lives, our souls belong to God and are in God's hands. And only there will we be safe. Not safe from doubt or disappointment or suffering or even death. Nothing can keep us from those things. And least of all, our possessions keep us from those things. But in God's hands, our lives and souls will be safe. Certainly from loss. The loss of meaning, the loss of purpose. It'll keep us from a loss of identity, a loss of community, a loss of hope, and certainly we'll be safe from the loss of God's presence and love. In this gospel reading today, when the whining brother demands that Jesus tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me, Jesus categorically refuses to mediate this family feud. He said there is only one inheritance, and Jesus is concerned with that. Our sharing the inheritance of God's kingdom. That's the inheritance. That is the true power and wealth that Jesus offers to everyone. As Jesus had warned his first disciples, there is no guarantee of physical security or earthly safety that comes from this inheritance. But he says, let us feast our souls on what the soul really needs, the eternal treasure on what Jesus does promise. It's another kind of wealth. Jesus promises richness and abundance of life, not a life of abundances. Jesus promises richer connections to God, not an address book filled with rich connections. Jesus promises deepened living in the presence of Christ, not a barn overfilled with stuff. The rich fool died alone without his treasures. God recalled his life, and I'm thinking that the brother who's sitting in that crowd stands up and approaches his other brother, and they walk up to Jesus, and they come to realize it doesn't have to be that way. There's a better way. Thanks be to God.